The thermometer outside Yelena Mikhailova's window read -62 degrees Celsius when she heard the gunshot that would change everything. In the remote Sakha Republic of northeastern Siberia, where winter darkness swallows the world for months and the cold can kill in minutes, that single crack echoing across the frozen wilderness meant only one thing: someone was in mortal danger. Yelena's weathered hands paused over the steaming bowl of deer stew she'd been preparing. At 53, she'd survived more Arctic winters than most people could imagine, but something about that gunshot sent ice through her veins that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. It came from the direction of old Dmitry Volkov's cabin, half a kilometer through the forest where the snow lay 3 meters deep and the trees stood like frozen sentinels in the endless night. She knew Dmitry kept a hunting rifle by his door. She also knew he had been able to walk properly since the logging accident crushed his legs 2 months ago. A man who could barely crawl to his own woodpile would unfire a weapon unless he was facing something terrible, or unless he was calling for help in the only way he could. The wind howled against her log cabin walls with the fury of a living thing, rattling windows thick with frost and sending spirals of snow through every crack. Outside, the world was a monochrome nightmare of white and black, where exposed skin could freeze solid in less than 5 minutes and the air itself seemed to burn the lungs. It was the kind of cold that made experienced hunters turn back, the kind that claimed lived without warning or mercy. Yelena pulled on her heaviest winter gear with practiced efficiency: 2 layers of wool, then the outer shell of reindeer fur that had belonged to her grandmother, felt boots rated for 70 below, a fox fur hat that covered everything but her eyes, mittens over gloves, over chemical hand warmers. Each layer was essential. Together they formed a difference between life and death in conditions that would kill most humans in minutes. She filled a thermos with a scalding stew and wrapped it in towels, then grabbed the emergency medical kit she deassembled years ago when she first moved to this remote corner of the world. The kerosene lantern went into her pack along with emergency flares, rope, and the satellite phone that might work if she could find a clear signal through the storm. The moment she opened her door, the cold hit her like a physical blow. The air was so frigid it seemed to have weight, pressing against her face and stealing her breath. Snow was unfalling so much as being driven horizontally by winds that screamed through the forest with hurricane force. Visibility extended maybe 10 meters before everything dissolved into a white void that could disorient even the most experienced outdoorsman. But Yelena had been walking these woods since she was 12 years old, when her Evenke's grandmother first brought her to this hunting camp and taught her the old ways of reading the land. Every tree, every slope, every frozen stream was mapped in her memory. She could navigate by the feel of the wind direction, by the way the cold bit differently when she faced north versus south, by sounds and scents that most people couldn't detect. She struck out into the storm, her snowshoes distributing her weight across snow so deep it could swallow a person whole. Each step was a conscious effort, her legs working against the resistance of powder that came up to her thighs. The cold was so intense it seemed to ring in her ears, a high-pitched whine that mixed with the constant roar of wind through the pines. 20 minutes into the journey, when her face had gone numb despite the fur hood, and her breath had formed a coating of ice on the inside of her makeshift face covering, she heard it again. Not a gunshot this time, but something worse. The howling of wolves. The sound came from ahead, from the direction of Dmitry's cabin, and it wasn't the distant song of a pack on the hunt. This was the aggressive snarling and barking of animals that had found prey, that were fighting over a kill or defending territory. In her 53 years in the Siberian wilderness, Yelena had learned to read the language of wolves. These sounds meant immediate danger. She quickened her pace despite the burning in her lungs from breathing air so cold it felt like inhaling glass. The thermos of stew bounced against her back with each labored step, still warm enough to provide life-saving calories and heat if she could reach Dmitry in time, if he was still alive to receive it. The wolves' calls grew louder as she approached the clearing where Dmitry's cabin sat like a dark island in an ocean of white. Through the storm, she could see flickering light in his windows and smoke rising from his chimney. Good signs. But the wolf sounds were coming from his front yard, where dark shapes moved against the snow like living shadows. Yelena crept closer, using the massive pine trees for cover. What she saw made her heart hammer against her ribs. 5 wolves, larger than any she'd seen before, were circling something on the ground near Dmitry's front door. The snow around them was disturbed, churned up by struggle, and she could see dark stains that could only be blood. But it wasn't human blood. As her eyes adjusted to the scene, she realized the wolves were feeding on the carcass of a massive brown bear. Even in the dim light of the storm, she could see it was one of the giant Kamchatka bears that occasionally wandered this far north, easily 300 kilograms of muscle and fury. The bear lay motionless, its fur already beginning to freeze, while the wolf pack tore at its flesh with a desperate hunger of animals facing their own survival crisis. The gunshot she'd heard had been Dmitry defending himself. Somehow, despite his crushed legs and limited mobility, the old logger had managed to kill a bear that could have torn through his cabin walls like paper. But now he was trapped inside while a hungry wolf pack claimed the carcass just meters from his door, and Dmitry would be running out of food soon. In his condition, he couldn't hunt or forage. The monthly supply drop wasn't due for another 3 weeks. Without help, he would starve long before the wolves finished their meal and moved on. Yelena studied the situation with the tactical mind of someone who spent decades surviving in conditions that killed the unprepared. The wolves were focused on the bear meat, but they'd attack anything that threatened their food source. She couldn't approach the cabin directly without walking into the middle of the pack. But she noticed something else, the cabin's back door, which opened onto a small woodshed that connected to Dimitri's main living space. She backed away from the clearing and began a wide circle through the forest, using the storm for cover. The detour added another kilometer to her journey through snow that seemed to get deeper with every step. The cold was becoming truly dangerous now. She could feel the beginnings of frostbite tingling in her toes despite her felt boots, and her hands were growing clumsy inside their layers of protection. But she pressed on, driven by something deeper than mere neighborly concern. In this vast, unforgiving wilderness where the nearest town was 200 kilometers away and rescue could be days or weeks in coming, people survived by taking care of each other. It was an unwritten law, as absolute as any force of nature. You didn't let someone die alone in the cold if there was anything you could do to prevent it. The back approach to Dimitri's cabin required crossing a frozen stream where the ice groaned ominously under her snowshoes and climbing a steep slope where the wind had sculpted the snow into knife-sharp ridges that cut at her exposed skin. By the time she reached the woodshed, her entire body was shaking from exertion and cold, and she knew she was approaching the limits of what even her experienced body could endure. She knocked on the shed's back door in the pattern they'd agreed on months ago. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short, Morse code for SOS. A joke between neighbors that had become their signal. For a terrifying moment, there was no response. Then she heard movement inside, slow and labored, and the scrape of something being dragged across the floor. Yelena. Dimitri's voice came through the thick wooden door, hoarse with pain and disbelief. "Is that really you? Open up, old fool," she called back, her words nearly lost in the wind. "I brought dinner." The door opened to reveal Dmitri Volkov in worse condition than she'd expected. The 60-year-old logger had always been built like a tree trunk, massive shoulders and arms that could handle timber most men couldn't lift. But the accident that had crushed both his legs had left him gaunt and hollow-eyed, dependent on makeshift crutches that barely allowed him to move around his small cabin. His face was gray with pain and exhaustion, and she could see he'd lost significant weight in the weeks since she'd last visited. "The bear," he said without preamble as she stepped inside the blessed warmth of the woodshed. "It broke through the front wall of my cache, went after my winter supplies. I heard it from inside and knew I had to act fast or lose everything." Yelena looked through the connecting door into his main room and saw the damage. One wall of his food storage area had been torn apart by claws and teeth. Cans and dried goods were scattered across the floor, most of it contaminated or destroyed. What the bear hadn't eaten or ruined wouldn't last him another week. "You killed it with one shot?" she asked, unwrapping the thermos of stew. Dmitri nodded grimly. "Lucky shot to the head when it reared up, but I used my last rifle cartridge doing it. And now there's a pack of wolves out there that won't leave until they've stripped every bit of meat from the bones." The situation was worse than Yelena had realized. Dmitri wasn't just facing starvation. He was completely defenseless and trapped in his own home. The wolves might decide the bear wasn't enough, might test the cabin's defenses looking for easier prey. And with the storm showing no signs of letting up, there was no way to signal for help or evacuation. She poured the steaming stew into one of his bowls and watched him eat with the desperate hunger of someone who'd been rationing dwindling supplies for too long. The hot food brought color back to his cheeks and steadied his shaking hands, but she could see the defeat in his eyes. He knew as well as she did that one meal wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. "There's more at my place," she said quietly. "Enough for both of us to last until the supply drop. If we're careful." "You can't keep making trips in this weather," Dmitri protested. "The cold will kill you, or the wolves will. I won't have your death on my conscience." But Yelena was already planning her next move. The storm was expected to last another 3 days. According to the weather reports she'd heard before her radio's batteries died, she had enough food at her cabin to keep them both alive, but someone would need to transport it. And with his injuries, Dmitri couldn't make the journey. Over the next hour, she helped him secure his damaged cache and showed him how to use mirrors and reflective metal to watch the wolves from inside without exposing himself at the windows. She left him half her emergency supplies and promised to return the next day with more food, despite his continued protests. The journey back to her cabin was a nightmare of white darkness and screaming wind. The wolves had finished feeding and dispersed back into the forest, but their tracks were everywhere in the snow, reminders of the other predators sharing this frozen world. By the time Yelena reached her own door, she was hypothermic and exhausted, her body temperature dangerously low despite all her protective gear. She spent the rest of that night by her fire, warming herself back to life and planning. The next day brought no improvement in the weather, but she made the trip anyway, carrying a backpack loaded with canned goods, dried meat, and another thermos of hot soup. This time she also brought her grandfather's old hunting rifle and ammunition, just in case the wolves returned. Day after day, as the storm raged with unprecedented fury, Yelena made the journey. Each trip was a battle against conditions that meteorologists would later classify as the worst winter weather recorded in the region in over 40 years. The temperature never rose above -58 degrees Celsius. The wind never dropped below hurricane force. Snow fell in quantities that buried entire villages in other parts of Siberia, but she kept going. Through whiteout conditions that disoriented her so completely she had to navigate by compass and dead reckoning. Through cold so intense it made her teeth ache and her lungs burn with every breath. Through exhaustion that left her stumbling and hypothermic, saved only by her decades of experience and sheer stubborn determination. On the fourth day, when she arrived at Dmitri's cabin with another load of supplies, she found him sitting by his window with binoculars, watching something in the forest that made his face grim with worry. "What is it?" she asked, following his gaze. "Smoke," he said simply. 3 kilometers southeast. Someone else is out there." Through the binoculars, Yelena could see a thin column of smoke rising from the forest, barely visible against the gray storm clouds, but definitely there. In this weather, at this temperature, an open fire meant someone was in serious trouble. It could be hunters trapped by the storm, or travelers who'd been caught in the open when their vehicle broke down. Whoever it was, they were burning whatever they could find to stay alive, which meant their situation was desperate. "We have to help them," Yelena said, though the words felt like stones in her throat. She was already pushing her own limits with the daily trips to keep Dmitri alive. Adding another rescue mission could be a death sentence for all of them. But that was the law of the wilderness. You helped whoever needed help, no matter the cost. In conditions this extreme, survival was a collective effort. Everyone lived, or everyone died. She left Dmitri with enough supplies for 3 days and struck out toward the smoke signal, following a compass bearing through terrain she'd never explored. The journey took her through areas where the snow was so deep she sometimes sank up to her chest despite the snowshoes, where fallen trees created barriers that forced long detours, where the cold was so savage it made her previous trips seem comfortable by comparison. What she found was worse than she'd imagined: a family of 5 from the regional capital. Their truck buried in a snowdrift after the road became impassable. The parents and their 3 children, ages 6 to 14, had been trapped for 6 days with minimal supplies, burning seat cushions and whatever else they could find to maintain a small fire in their broken vehicle. The father was unconscious from hypothermia. The mother was barely coherent, focused entirely on keeping her children warm. The children themselves were in the early stages of frostbite and malnutrition, their small bodies losing the fight against cold that would have killed adults in hours. Yelena knew immediately that she couldn't save them all. Not in these conditions. Not with the distance back to shelter. Not with her own reserves nearly exhausted from weeks of extreme exertion. But she also knew she couldn't leave them to die. She made the hardest decision of her life. She would take the children first. Using rope and her emergency sled, she began the agonizing process of transporting the 3 kids back to Dmitri's cabin, 1 trip at a time. Each child required individual attention to prevent hypothermia during the journey. Careful monitoring of their breathing and heart rate, constant encouragement to keep them moving and alert. The 6-year-old Anna was in the worst condition. Her lips were blue and her speech slurred from cold exposure. Yelena carried her the entire distance, sharing her own body heat, forcing her to drink warm liquid from the thermos every few minutes to keep her core temperature stable. The middle child, 12-year-old Pavel, was stronger but suffering from severe frostbite on his hands and feet. Yelena had to stop repeatedly to massage circulation back into his extremities, using techniques her grandmother had taught her for treating cold injuries in the field. 14-year-old Katya was physically capable of walking but emotionally devastated by leaving her parents behind. She kept trying to turn back, sobbing that they were abandoning her family to die. Yelena had to use every ounce of her psychological strength to keep the girl moving forward, promising they would return for the adults as soon as the children were safe. By the time she delivered all 3 children to Dmitri's cabin, Yelena was operating on pure willpower. Her body had nothing left to give. She'd been in survival mode for over a week, expending calories and energy at an unsustainable rate, pushing through cold and exhaustion that would have killed most people days earlier. But she went back for the parents anyway. The father died during the return journey, his body finally surrendering to hypothermia despite Yelena's efforts to revive him. She carried his body back to the cabin anyway, knowing that leaving him in the forest would traumatize his children beyond repair. The mother survived, barely, though she would lose 3 toes to frostbite and carry the scars of the experience for the rest of her life. For 2 more weeks. As the storm finally began to weaken and the first rescue helicopters could attempt flights in the marginally improved weather, Yelena kept all 6 survivors alive in Dmitri's small cabin. She rationed the remaining food supplies with mathematical precision, melted snow for water, maintained the fire, treated injuries, and provided the psychological support that kept the traumatized family from succumbing to despair. When the rescue team finally arrived, they found 7 people who'd survived conditions that meteorologists called unsurvivable. The temperature had remained below -50 degrees for 18 consecutive days. The wind had averaged over 100 kilometers per hour. Snow accumulation had reached record levels across the entire region. The rescue team leader, a veteran pilot who'd flown Arctic missions for 20 years, told Yelena that what she'd accomplished was impossible. No one could have made those journeys in those conditions. No one could have kept that many people alive with so few resources. No one could have survived the physical and psychological stress of the situation she'd endured. But Yelena just shrugged and asked when they were going to evacuate Dmitry, whose legs still needed proper medical attention. The story spread quickly through the small communities of the Sakha Republic. News outlets picked it up, then international media. Yelena found herself labeled a hero, a title that made her deeply uncomfortable. She'd simply done what anyone would do, she insisted. She'd helped her neighbors survive. What she never told the reporters was the real reason she kept making those daily trips through weather that should have killed her. It wasn't heroism or some noble sense of duty. It was something much simpler and more human. She could unbear the thought of Dmitry dying alone. Her own husband had died alone, 7 years earlier. When a heart attack struck him while she was away visiting her sister in the regional capital, she'd returned to find his body frozen in their cabin, and the guilt of not being there in his final moments had haunted her ever since. She'd moved to this remote location partly to escape that memory, to live simply and quietly in the wilderness she'd always loved. But when she heard that gunshot and knew Dmitry was in danger, all those feelings came flooding back. She couldn't save her husband, but she could save this stubborn old logger who'd become her closest friend in this isolated corner of the world. The rescued family visited her the following spring, after the father had been buried and the mother and children had recovered from their ordeal. The mother, Elena Petrov, told Yelena that she'd named her newborn daughter after her. The child conceived during the summer after their rescue. Little Yelena would grow up knowing the story of the woman who'd saved her family in the worst storm in living memory. Dmitry recovered the use of his legs through surgery and physical therapy funded by donations from people who'd heard their story. He returned to his cabin the next winter, but this time he installed a proper radio system and emergency supplies that could last 3 months instead of 3 weeks. The two neighbors developed a routine after that. Every morning during the winter months, regardless of weather, they would radio each other to confirm they were alive and well. If either one failed to make contact, the other would make the journey to check on them. It was a simple system, born from the understanding that in the vast Siberian wilderness, survival depended on taking care of each other. In a place where the cold could kill and the distances were measured in days rather than kilometers, being a good neighbor wasn't just common courtesy, it was a matter of life and death. The storm that had brought them all together became legend in the region, remembered as the Winter of Impossible Survival. Weather stations recorded it as the most severe Arctic storm system in recorded history for that part of Siberia. But for Yelena, it would always be remembered as the winter she learned that the warmest place in the world was not by a fire or inside heated walls. It was in the simple act of caring for another human being, even when it meant walking through hell to do it. That caring, that determination to ensure no one faced the darkness alone, proved stronger than any storm nature could create. And in a land where winter lasted 8 months and the cold could steal your life in minutes, that strength was the difference between civilization and chaos, between community and isolation, between living and merely surviving. The food she brought Dmitry every day was unjust sustenance for the body. It was proof that neither of them was truly alone in the vast, frozen wilderness they called home. This incredible story of survival against impossible odds shows us that heroism isn't about grand gestures or seeking recognition. Sometimes it's found in the daily choice to show up for someone who needs help, even when the cost is enormous. Yelena's determination to care for her neighbor in conditions that claimed lives across the region reminds us that our humanity is measured not by what we achieve for ourselves, but by what we're willing to sacrifice for others. What would you do in similar circumstances? Have you ever had a neighbor who went above and beyond to help you through a difficult time? Share your thoughts below. These stories of human resilience and community spirit need to be told and remembered. And if this story moved you, help us share more incredible tales of survival and heroism by sharing it with others who might need to hear it.